All right, so we're starting the stream. It is 6:30 on a Monday, so that means we're starting another live study session. God has given us another opportunity, so why not take advantage? Nor, good morning. It's going to be a good day, he says, he or she. Daniel, good morning over there on YouTube. Nice to see YouTubers come in right away. Rochelle says, that's what I say. By the way, guys, if you're not familiar with me, although the early birds here are probably familiar with me, this is my link tree, linktr.ee/wolfpox, and that's where you can find all sorts of stuff, including my YouTube channel, the books that I wrote. This one is Maybe Everyone is Wrong. That one's all about Revelation, prophecy, the book of Daniel, the prophecies of Daniel, lots of things connecting the New Testament, the Old Testament, and prophecies together with history and the global satanic conspiracy. And this is my follow-up book to that, which is really about the modern-day New Age movement and the infiltration of psyops into Christian thinking, trying to warn people about the deceivers around us that are luring us into, well, the Green World Order, the same thing that I talk about in this one. So it's really a focus on the main threat I identified in my book on Revelation. I did a follow-up just on that threat. Daniel says, the Chloros green, that blew my mind. Yeah, there are people who recognize that it was should be translated as green, but it seemed like nobody was actually connecting the green in that prophecy to the current day rise of the green movement taking over finance and politics and everything, and going for this depopulation campaign. So, but along with that, that's one of the things that I didn't have time to go into in the Revelation book, is that the green movement is about a lot more than just environmentalism and depopulation. It actually involves New Ageism. It involves mysticism and aliens and this idea of experimental science, the breakdown between mysticism and science. And so there's a lot of things in Fire in the Rabbit Hole that I wrote about that is just becoming more and more true with every passing week. The reason why it's called Fire in the Rabbit Hole is because, I don't know about you guys, but I see people all over the place now bragging about how they're going down these different rabbit holes, whether it's Tartaria and the idea of this ancient lost civilization, or flat earth, or QAnon, or psychedelic drugs, or meditation, all these different things that seem unrelated at first. But my argument is that it's all part of the Green World Order, and there's an underlying connection, and it involves the military, it involves psychological warfare, it involves a lot of things. So yeah, Fire in the Rabbit Hole. It doesn't have, I mean, it's a year newer than the other book. I wrote it after I got banned from TikTok, and I'm planning on doing a second edition with more quotes, because things just keep happening to prove my point, and it becomes more and more obvious. But like the whole King Charles thing, and like King Charles' obsession with the Green Movement, and there's just so many different aspects that have happened just since I published the book that I want to do a second edition that'll have updated material. But I don't know when I can get around to that, because I'm writing another new book and, doing this and just doing so many things. But at some point, I want to do a second edition of that book. Rachel, no, today's topic is just a continuation of our study of Corinthians. We're going to do 1 Corinthians chapter 11 today. That's the plan. I may as well get started pretty soon here. And Unbreakable says, do you have a website? The website, the best thing you could do right now is to go to this link tree, which is linked in my bio, and that will give you links to my Discord channel and my Substack where I write articles, all sorts of stuff. I do technically have wolfpox.com, and there are free essays available on there that I've written in PDF form. You can just download them and read them for free. I have one on covenants and how we are not under the old covenant of the law. I have one on predestination. I have one on the protocols of Zion and the Jesuits. Yeah, it's pretty good stuff on that website too, I got to say. Okay. Daniel says, I'd imagine following prophecy and world events, you're going to have to re-update that book every day. Well, yeah, that's kind of the thing. When is the correct time to update the book, right? So anyway, we're on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which means that there's only 5 more chapters after this. Yeah, Unbreakable, those PDFs, I haven't gotten really any feedback on them yet, but if you do download any of them, let me know what you think on Telegram, or if you revisit the stream here in the mornings. We do this at 6:30 a.m. Central Time, 4 times a week, God willing. And, however you want to reach out, I have a Twitter account, whatever. Let me know what you think of it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, okay? A bunch of people that normally show up don't seem to be here today, but thank you for those who are, and thank you for the 750 likes already. Let me just start reading here and see what we got. First verse of Corinthians 11 says, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." That's already a very important statement. Paul is not saying, be imitators of Christ. He is saying, be imitators of me, as I am also of Christ. And so, of course, Paul is trying to imitate Christ, but he's a step removed from Christ. He's just a man. He's not the Son of God. He is not a prophet. He's not on that level. So these people should feel comfortable just imitating Paul, not because he's radically different from Christ, but because he is trying to imitate Christ. So it's imitation by proxy. This is what it means to be a disciple. One of the definitions of being a disciple is basically to be an imitation of somebody, a student of theirs, somebody who directly copies and says, well, this guy's doing this, I guess that means I should be doing it too. It's a trust issue. And so I find that interesting. I would probably never tell anyone, be an imitator of me. But then again, I was not handpicked by Jesus, blinded and spoken to the way that Paul was. And I am nothing like Paul, so I wouldn't presume to be able to do and say the things that he was saying and doing. He learned, we read that the other day, he learned about the gospel directly from Jesus, not from a person. Travis says, YouTube does not show you live. Let me quickly check why that would be the case. According to my streaming information here, there's 5 people watching on YouTube. People getting a look at my subscriptions list there. I don't know. There's definitely 5 people who are watching on YouTube. So, and some comments are coming in. So I assume that there's people who can watch me live there. Squeaky says, as a Mr. Wolf, do you ever say lunchtime when anybody's asking the time? fellow Mr. Wolf here. Hey, lunchtime. No, but I have, when I was younger, I made my share of, what's the time, Mr. Wolf jokes. Yeah, Daniel, I think what he's saying is that the notification is not showing up as me being live as it should be. And we'll have to find out. DB says, seems to be live on my YouTube. And Rachel says, on YouTube, you're there too. So maybe Travis is, unfortunately, for some reason, not seeing the stream. I would have to try to figure that out. Okay. That's just the first verse. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Verse 2. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. This doesn't even sound like the same people that he's writing to. He's just been criticizing them over and over again, but now he's praising them. Let's try to figure that out. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. Okay, this is getting into this is the famous passage about the head of the man and the head of the woman. But before we get into that, I wonder what traditions he was passing on, and if we'll figure out what these traditions he passed on were. He says that they remember him in what they do, and they hold firmly to the traditions. So clearly, Paul taught them something, and he's trying to remind them that it's good that you are copying me, or you're doing what I told you to do. But then somehow that is going to be connected with this elaborate metaphor that I have heard so many people try to explain, and let's see if we can do any sort of justice to it. Verse 3 says, of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman. And God is the head of Christ. Every man who does something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. Who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. Ooh, that's already so in the weeds as far as what that means. Verse 5, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. So just here, at least in this translation, okay, no. Every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. So she should have her head covered. But the man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. So the men's heads should be covered when they're praying or prophesying, and the woman's heads no, sorry, I'm just misunderstanding this. It's not that complicated. I'm just, for some reason, not getting it right away. The man should have his head uncovered. The woman should have her head covered. Okay, that's simple. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. This one verse here, oh boy, I've seen preachers and pastors try to dance around this verse like it's gymnastics class, but it's so straightforward. Of course, there's metaphorical layers to this, but still. Verse 8, for man does not originate from woman. That's sort of oxymoronic. It's a chicken and egg thing. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Every man was born from a woman, wasn't he? According to Paul, man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. And of course, that goes back to Genesis, where the man was made first, and the woman was made from the man. That reverses the idea that every man was born from a woman. He seems to be applying it universally as a matter of something you could apply in your daily life as an idea, a relationship between men and women. Women should not think that they are above man, is what I am getting so far from this whole passage. Let's see how many comments I've missed. Debbie, welcome, says, like a hat on hair? Never understood this part in real life today. Pam says, this was written to one church, not all. All right, well, that's a theory. Welcome, Lemuel. Good morning. What a way to start off a Monday morning, huh? This is one of those passages of the Bible that has been debated for 2,000 years. I was hoping that when we encountered this, the context of the rest of the book so far would give us a big help. And I'm not seeing it right away, so let's just keep going here, and then we can figure it out as we go. Man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. Verse 9, for indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. That's also pretty crystal clear. This person, Pam, says that's written to just one church, but I don't see how this logic could not possibly apply to Paul's entire worldview when he's saying man was not created for woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Welcome, summertime. Good morning. You got a big, sun emoji there, but it's proper winter where I am. It's snow on the ground. I barely even see the sun. So maybe that's good. I get to see a little sunlight in my chat room. Verse 10, therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. I've heard a theory about that is from Michael Heiser. You guys are probably familiar with Michael Heiser. And it's pretty wild. I'll have to see if I can paraphrase it. Verse 11, however, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. So now he seems to be stepping back from what he was saying before. Let me see these. User 25 says, my students are coming soon. Is there a place where I can watch these lessons? And somebody said on YouTube, if you want to check my Linktree, it's Linktree/Wolfpox, and that has a link to my YouTube channel. This link is in my TikTok bio, so you can just click on that or tap on that. It'll open up a menu, and then you'll see a link to my YouTube channel there. Or you can just type that in, or you can look up Wolfpox on YouTube, because that's also just my YouTube handle. Or you can look up Terry Wolf. Yeah, that's my real name. Wolfpox is my handle. Terry Wolf is my real name. No problem. Thanks for asking. Live in Legend says, which scriptures are for review today? That's 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And yes, you can absolutely ask questions. This is quite a chapter. I mean, this is a big one. This one has a lot of implications. Hudson's Homestead says, cool name. I agree. So, he just barely was saying how man came first. Man was not created for the woman's sake. Woman was created for the man's sake. Woman has to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, whatever that means. However, in the Lord, woman is independent. Neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. The woman originates from the man, so also man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. Now, in verse 13, he says, judge for yourselves. Meaning this is not a direct commandment from God. He's just asking them, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? Is it? Obviously, it's sort of a rhetorical question. And then he goes on to say, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is dishonor to him? This goes against, by the way, the whole idea that Jesus had super long hair, if anyone cares about that. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her. I would say that is still very true in our culture today, despite short haircuts being popular here and there. That's something that women do, for various reasons. But generally speaking, you can just look at pop culture and general trends, and it's still obviously true that naturally women grow out their hair, and it's considered to be a glory to her to have long hair. And men, when they have long hair, they look weird in our culture. And it's still considered that way, despite all the progressive politics, despite all the, different phases that fashion has gone through. It says, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. What does that mean? No other practice. King James says we have no such custom. New American Standard Bible says we have no such practice. New American Standard Bible, 1995, says we have no other practice. The literal translation says we have no such practice. Let's look up the interlinear. If now anyone is inclined contentious to be, we such custom no have, nor the churches of God. Why is other here in parentheses? The Greek word ook just means no or not, the negative. And I don't see why you would throw the word other in there. It seems like it's pretty obviously just him saying we don't actually have, if you want to fight about it, we don't actually have that as an official practice that you have to cover your head and, worry about your hair length. But then some, like this New American Standard Bible 1995, that's funny because even the New American Standard Bible it keeps taking me to the 1995 version. It says we have no such practice. Verse 16. I.e., the one advocated by Paul's opponents. Oh, I see. So in verse 16 it says, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor have the churches of God, meaning those who are contending against him. I don't know. The one advocated by Paul's opponents have such practice. Oh, okay. So he's saying, even if you disagree with me, just know that that doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem right. I don't think you can throw that in there. Does this not seem clearly like Paul is actually saying, if anyone disagrees a lot, this isn't an official policy. But these translations are trying to make it sound like, yes, this is the policy. And, those who are contentious, we have no such practice as they have. But he already said in verse, where was it? Verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? So why would he say, judge for yourselves, and then later say, this is, an absolute rule, and this is what all the churches of God do? It seems like it's just him saying, look, use your own brain. If you want to fight about it, it's not that we have this big custom about it. It's not a rule. It's just common sense, obey your own common sense. Living Legend said, looking upon their beauty, I think, what about Samson and his hair? Well, I will actually talk about that. That's a good point. Stapleton, we are looking at 1 Corinthians 11, somewhere around verse 13 to 16 right now. Wealthgistic says, wouldn't know wouldn't Paul know hair length if he's seen Jesus and made a comment of that length in Paul's writings? Paul should have seen Jesus in the vision that he had. And so I assume that he wouldn't make a insulting comment about long hair on a man if Jesus had long hair. I mean, I just don't think Paul would go there if Jesus Christ was the exception. That doesn't seem to add up to me. Henry and Susie, welcome. Travis says, no other teachings about head coverings. Could he be stating about shaving their heads? Oh, so it is working for you to come on YouTube. That's good. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on here. First of all, I want to address this idea about Samson because that's a good point to bring up. Samson only had long hair because he refused to do what God told him to do. The Nazirite vow of not shaving your head was meant to be actually a disgrace. If you didn't do what you vowed to do, your hair would keep growing and it would become more and more shameful that you weren't doing what you promised God. Because once you did it, you could shave your head. That was the whole idea of the vow, is that, you know, it would be like if I said, I'm going to write a book and I'm not going to shave my head until, you know, the book is written. And then my hair grows down to the middle of my back. It's like, hey, man, obviously we can all see you're not doing what you promised to do. It's not actually a symbol of glory, or it's not his secret power and God wanted him to have long hair. That was actually supposed to be a illustration of how long he was taking to do what he was going to do. And I think the main reason why people say Jesus had long hair was because he was called a Nazarene. And people think that Nazarene and being from Nazareth has a relationship to making a Nazirite vow, which is not the case. I recently found that out doing a deep dive into the city of Nazareth, or the town village of Nazareth, and the Nazirite vow. Those are actually, believe it or not, completely unrelated things. First of all, people aren't even sure if Nazareth was a real town or it was such a small village that it basically didn't even show up in any records anywhere. Nazareth is apparently scholars and archaeologists have no idea about it being real, because the only mention of it is basically from the New Testament, and then the later Christians who write about it because they're Christians and they believe the New Testament. The Nazirite vow is an Old Testament thing where, and it might have been outside of Israel too, it might have just been a thing in the ancient world, that you would make a vow such as that, and then certain Jews just did that same thing. It might have not have even originated with Israel. It definitely seems like something that is kind of like it's only mentioned once properly with Samson, and then it's implied again with Samuel, and then in the New Testament there are people who go and take vows to not eat or drink or do anything until they kill the Apostle Paul or the disciple Paul, for example. But then it's not called a Nazirite vow. So I think that people got confused about Nazarene and Nazirite. And so they gave Jesus long hair as if he never cut his hair, just like Samson. But that has nothing to do with Jesus, because Nazirite in the Old Testament was not regional. It was not a place. It's not that Samson came from a place called Nazareth or, anything like that. The Hebrew word translated as Nazirite is apparently from the same word that means to be separate or to be set aside for something. And so taking a Nazirite vow basically means that you're going to be an exception. You're going to stand apart and stand out from everybody else around you because you're making a certain vow. Being from Nazareth is one of these odd things in the New Testament that we have verses saying that he will be called a Nazarene. People say Jesus of Nazareth. But that had nothing to do with a Nazirite vow, so there's no reason Jesus has to have long hair. And I'm going to go ahead and say that I think there's an ulterior motive for that based on the Catholic influence over the depiction of Jesus in their artwork, where they make Jesus look as effeminate as possible and give him super long hair and these huge watery looking eyes and this very effeminate narrow face and no muscles and no basically he looks androgynous. And there's been a lot of people over the centuries who have pointed out that the Catholic depiction of Jesus is very androgynous, because they seem to want him to embody some sort of dualistic male and feminine role at the same time, because that has something to do with their old pagan idea of what's glorious and beautiful, and anyway, there's this whole Catholic thing with feminine Jesus. Anyway, that's the Samson long hair part of that. Now, as for women shaving their heads, I think it's very commonly understood that a woman shaving her head back then was a symbol that she was a prostitute. And so the idea is that if she's not going to cover her head and therefore show that she has a man above her or an authority that she cares about above her, that she's like a prostitute. This then goes back to the whole, because I guess one of the reasons would be that she would wear a wig or a headdress or something like that. I mean, prostitutes still do that to this day. The idea that they shave their real hair and then they just wear different wigs, depending on what they're trying to appeal to. Living Legend says the Messiah had short hair until he took on the task of leading and took so hair long. Well, actually, no. What I'm saying is that Jesus probably never had long hair. There's just no reason in the text to believe that. And it doesn't have anything to do with being from Nazareth. It's not like every guy that came from Nazareth had long hair. The style at the time in general, with Greeks and Romans especially, would have been short hair. Jews were not known for having long hair. Clearly, Paul, being a very Jewish man who also comes from this Roman city, and being a Pharisee, he's sort of bordering these two worlds of the Roman and the Jewish, and he's just straight up saying, hey, it's just common sense that it's disgraceful for a man to have long hair. So how would he possibly say that if it was common for Jews or Romans or Greeks, for that matter, to have long hair? I mean, you would just be insulting one of these key demographics, and he's specifically using this as a common sense argument that just says, look around you, look at the examples around you. Isn't it inappropriate for a man to have long hair? And he's not criticizing the men of Corinth for having long hair. They're not. The men here, he never says that the men in Corinth have long hair. His point is to say that there's supposed to be a difference between the man and the woman. And the women are not covering their heads. And he's just saying your hair is already a covering, but you should have a symbol of covering it yet when you pray or prophesy. Not all the time, so that's a different misconception that women were supposed to always and permanently have a head covering. I come from Mennonites. It's very common for old-fashioned Mennonites to have their heads covered, Mennonite women to have their heads covered all the time, kind of like an Amish thing. Quakers, I believe, had the same practice. That's not even what it says here. Your hair as a woman is a natural covering, and the longer it is, the more glorious it is, according to his sort of common sense assessment. Verse 15. But if a woman has long hair, isn't it a glory to her? Her hair is given to her as a covering. But when you're praying or prophesying as a woman, he's saying to cover your head. Now, I have to give you Michael Heiser's take on this, because apparently... Oh, welcome, Jay Thompson. Nice to see you again. Michael Heiser's analysis of this is so bizarre that I would never have guessed it, although he makes a very good argument for why women were supposed to have their heads actually covered when they pray and prophesy specifically. And this is going to be a weird thing, so just brace yourself for this. When you pray or prophesy, you are making a sort of an invitation to heaven. Remember, it said in which verse? Verse 10. It says, "Therefore the woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." Now let's look up the different translations of that. The English Standard says, "That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." King James says the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. NET says, "This reason a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." It's pretty universally understood the same way. Now, what possible reason could there be for angels to get involved with a woman having her head covered or not? And what does it have to do with your head being shaved or not shaved? Stapleton interrupts and says she started reading "Maybe Everyone is Wrong" and couldn't put it down. Terry, you are gifted. Thank you very much. Yeah, if you're not familiar, that's the book, "Maybe Everyone is Wrong," and that's a link where you can find it. Linktree/Wolfpox. That the book is quite something. Michael Heiser says that the reason why a woman is supposed to have her head covered and why it would be especially bad to have her head shaved is because of an old Greek concept for how bodily fluids work and how women relate to angels. He took a long time explaining it. I'm going to try to give you a short version. It's going to sound very weird. I realize now I probably won't be able to do it justice. But Greeks had an idea of sperm not being what we understand sperm to be, but just this general idea of fluid that is some sort of fluid that's in the body. They thought it flowed to different parts of the body and affected all sorts of things. It would probably be wrong to even use the word sperm because it doesn't even correlate to what we think of now. It's just some sort of fluid in the body, sexually related somehow, but or maybe semen or something like that. But anyway, the idea was that hair contains that fluid. It grows because of that fluid going up to the head and then being somehow contained in the hair. And this was supposed to explain, the Greeks thought that this explained why men eventually, as they got older, went bald at the same time that they lost their sexual prowess. So once you don't have that fluid going to your head and causing your hair to grow, then obviously it's going away. And so you don't have as much hair. For a woman to have long hair is not only a covering of nature, it is because she doesn't have the same body parts as a man. She's not supposed to have short hair because it redistributes the fluid in her body or something like that, and it makes her more like a man and confuses the body and its development. Again, I'm giving you a simplified version here. There's actual medical Greek books written back then that talk about this theory. I forget what the theory is called, but it has a proper name. It's like Greek seminal fluid theory or something like that. It's a misunderstanding of hormones. Yeah, they didn't even understand the idea of hormones. They just thought that there was this fluid that went around. And apparently what Paul is doing is referencing that. And then where angels come in is like this idea that like before the flood, where angels came down and were tempted by women who were obviously, making themselves available to some extent or something like that, that basically when a woman is praying and prophesying, she is making a special invitation to heaven and where the angels are. And then they will, of course, notice her because she's praying. But if they notice her and she's basically being indecent and upsetting the natural flow of her whatever fluid that was the Greeks thought was responsible for these things, it would basically make her show that she had no authority over her, right? That's how it ties into the rest of this discussion. He says it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, so she should have her head, covered. Now, I guess this is just it's like a state of spiritual vulnerability that is tied to sexuality. And so what Paul is trying to do is this absolutely bizarre, but in his mind very, important comparison to a woman acknowledging that she should have a man above her, a husband, that is to say, not just a random man, but a husband, to protect her, to show, this is what I've been saying over these different chapters, that women were considered to be the property of men. You were the property of your father until your father gave you to a man, and then when you were under your husband, then he was your protector, he was your head covering, he was your the one that sanctifies you. There was no such thing back then as an independent woman except for prostitutes. Prostitutes were free and independent. By the way, thank you for the 5,000 likes. If you guys tap the screen, we can bump that number up quickly to 10,000 or something like that if you want to. So there was no such thing in the ancient world as an independent woman except for prostitutes. And prostitutes would shave their heads. I'm not sure why. It might have been related to lice or, the fact that they didn't have such good conditions. It might have been wigs, headdresses. It might have been just a way of showing that, just like how there's different ways that a woman nowadays can sort of signal or indicate that she's doesn't care about Christianity, whether it's some sort of makeup or tattoos or piercings or whatever. There's always been ways for a woman to basically show that she's not a conservative, spoken for woman, and that she's out there and ready to, have a man. So that was how a woman showed that back then. Now, it also so happens that in Greece especially, this is going to sound weird to us today, there was so much homosexuality in ancient Greece. Oh boy, this is this is why I did a whole lecture on Greek sexuality in my YouTube channel. Greek men had a philosophy that sex with men was the actual desirable casual sex. It was what they actually romanticized the most, is homosexuality. And especially young men. And then women, Greeks considered women to be an obligation to the state. That you had to get married and have kids in order to grow the population of Greece, but that there was no particular pleasure or enjoyment with a woman. So if you wanted to have something like a prostitute or a one-night stand or a random encounter or, anything like that, you would find a boy. The pederasty was huge in Greece. And so for a woman to shave her head makes her look more like a little boy. Do you get it? She looks more like, like how a young woman with completely short hair, if she's, she looks kind of like a little, like a young man, because her hair is different, and a young man is going to have more feminine features than an older man, especially a strong older man who looks completely different, and the hair and all the stuff. We know that puberty affects men differently than women. So the woman with a shaved head resembles a young, available man. And so it's a sign that in Greek culture, she's not only available, she's a prostitute who is trying to, it's a reversal of what you have now with, men pretending to be women to trick guys. Back then, it was women trying to trick guys into pretending to be young boys. I'm not making that up. You can look up Wikipedia, look up Greek love. There's a whole thing about it. I did a whole YouTube lecture on it. As far as I can tell, what Paul is trying to say here is, because he's writing to the Corinthians, right? He's not writing to Jews here. The women of Corinth and all these different Greek cities would have to compete with young underage boys for the older men in relationships, and especially in casual encounters and stuff. So they would shave their heads and try to look more boyish. Literally, the Greek style of doing things was so common that Roman generals and kings and emperors and stuff were known to have secret, because in Rome, homosexuality was actually considered bad. If the public found out that their leader was a homosexual or bisexual, they would actually hate them and want to potentially kill them, because it was considered disgraceful to the Romans. but not to the Greeks. And Rome basically took over all of Greece and then had to deal with the Greek culture. And it actually transferred over to the point where all these different Greek emperors, Caesars, had their own boys on the side. And that was part of their whole temple thing. It was part of their ritual orgies and their festivals and feasts. And so, and then there's like Roman Caesars who are like, their jealous boyfriends, kill them in their bathtub because they're so jealous that they have a wife and kids and they want to just have the Roman emperor for themselves. I mean, this is what Christianity grew up in, is this culture of extremism in the pagan culture. I mean, there's a reason why Christianity was a revolutionary, dangerous ideology when it came out, and it was because it was completely departing from the legalistic Jewish way of doing things, of just guilt and strictness of legalist thinking, while still completely rejecting the Greek and Roman cultures that had been so corrupted with their paganism. Live in Legend says, what are the names of these people biblically? I'm not talking about biblical characters here. This is just history of, known Caesars, and I forget what the name of the Caesar is who got drowned in the bathtub by his boyfriend, but that's a well-known historical story. I'm not a big history buff on Romans in particular, so I don't know, but Godlove says, nothing new under the sun. Wow, so twisted and wicked. Lovely soul, good morning. So anyway, this whole thing that Paul is talking about here is not common sense to us today, right? He's talking about how a woman should essentially accept that she needs a man, a husband, that the husband is a stable partner that is above her and protecting her and guiding her, and she was made for his sake, and he is supposed to lead her, so that the woman is never an independent woman like we have nowadays, with the idea that women are just floating around doing whatever they want. They have no authority over them. Back then it was your father was in charge of you, and then your husband was in charge of you, and they wanted to ideally have zero gap where she was independent. And this might actually tie all the way back to the idea of angels being covetous of women who are not married. Available women would be tempting to angels in their way of thinking about it. Now, is there any truth to that at all? Is that something that Paul is writing about here, and he's just going off of nature and customs and common sense as he understood it at the time? I'm not sure. I really don't know, because there's a couple things here. Over and over here, he's appealing to logic and nature. He's saying in verse 14, does even nature itself not teach you? And he's phrasing it as a question. And then he's saying, judge for yourselves. Verse 13, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? If you asked me, if Paul said, judge for yourself, is it proper? I'd say, of course it's proper. If you're praying to God, your heart is in the right place. Clearly you're not a prostitute, or you're not just living some sort of evil life. What does it matter if your head is uncovered or not? This has nothing to do with your intention, with what God wants you to have. You're already doing the right thing. So why are we, saying that it's evil? And how are angels going to get involved? I mean, we're living in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is in charge of the angels. Is it going to be demons who are trying to affect her? Fallen angels? Even so, doesn't the Holy Spirit protect her, even if she's single? We know that virgins in the Bible, virgin women, are the most common ones who are actually giving prophecies. Generally, it's not married women who are giving prophecies, it's virgin women who are giving prophecies. So God seems to have some sort of preference for virgin women for giving prophecies. I'm not saying that's generally true always or anything like that, but that's just the pattern that I think we can see in the Bible. So I don't see, if Paul was to ask me, I would say that's not necessary anymore. And that's why when this comes in verse 16 and it says, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor have the churches of God. That's why it's important to me that that verse is taken literally and not throwing in other words in there like some of these translations are, because essentially what he's saying at the end is, if anybody doesn't agree with what I just said, it's okay, because we don't actually have that as a practice, and neither does any of the churches of God. But kind of like just, hey, at least think about it. Isn't it kind of, disgraceful for a man to have long hair like a woman? Isn't it disgraceful for a woman to have short hair or have her head shaved to try to look like a little boy so that these Greek men would be attracted to them? That whole thing is a lot to unpack, but Michael Heiser tries to give an extra explanation with the fluids and how this Greek theory of health and fertility and stuff that had to do with hair length. Lovely Soul says, I just watched Mike Winger, which, by the way, I like Mike Winger. If anyone isn't familiar with Mike Winger, he reminds me of myself in a couple of different ways, and I appreciate his ministry. 6 hours and 45-minute breakdown on this very chapter. Okay, well, I'm not going to spend that long doing it. He says it's about roles as men and women as it pertains to the relationship with Jesus Christ and God. Well, that is absolutely true, but it doesn't explain why he was using this specific language the way that he does here. Mike Winger, if I remember correctly, I've seen some of his things on relationships, and I feel like he isn't trying to go back to the original intention of Paul as much as to basically get past the historical confusion or roots of what was said there and sort of get to the point of what we should be taking away from it, which is totally fine, because the point that we can take away from it does have to do with the relationship of men and women in Christ. And we're going to continue now and have more, explanation as well. Jacob says, what are your thoughts about Titus 11, verse 1? If it's related, I will comment on it. If it's not, I will probably just save that for a different time. I think you mean 1 verse 11, because there's only 3 chapters in Titus. So let's see, Titus 1 verse 11. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. I don't think that's what you wanted me to study, so we're just going to leave that alone. So, that's some backstory on Greece anyway, and why having short hair might have meant a bunch of different things. Does it apply at all to our culture? If I see a woman who was trying to prophesy or pray and she wanted to cover her head with like an extra covering of some kind, and she was doing it because of these verses, I would think that's very quaint, and it's kind of cute. It's a neat idea. It says here men are not supposed to have their heads covered, because he is the image and glory of God. Now that is that goes beyond what Genesis says. That Genesis says we were made in God's image, but it doesn't say we are the glory of God. Paul is saying we are the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. This is where, as much as I love Paul, I mean, he's going further than the Old Testament does. I think I understand his point and that he is saying something true here, but it could be so easily twisted by people that it's a dangerous thing to make a big point about. I might at some point try to just, make a defense of Paul here. It's especially weird because he's talking to Greeks who do consider men to be glorious and women to be ugly and inferior, and they didn't enjoy their women as much as their men, and didn't think of women as being as glorious as men, and that's why they have all these statues of men and naked men and paintings of naked men on their temples, and they love their Greek gods. They're all these muscular naked men and all this stuff. That the glory of their gods is certainly masculine, and they do have female goddesses, and there's cults based on Athena and Diana and these different female goddesses for sure. It's not like they're all homosexual or something like that. It's more of a bisexual thing going on in Greece. So for him to say that we are the image and glory of God to a Greek-speaking people feels to me like he's trying to use a little bit of their logic and then steer them into a more Christian/Jewish way of looking at things. He's trying to temper their views with something better, which would speak to what we saw him say, he's all things to all men. He says just in the last chapter, a couple verses earlier, he says, just as I also please everyone in all things, not seeking my own benefit, but the benefit of the many so that they may be saved. He says, do not offend Jews or Greeks or the church of God. And then the very next verses, he starts talking about this stuff, right? So there's a chapter break, but really the chapter break is false. And he's just continuing from this statement of, I know you guys are Greeks, but he also in the last chapter was trying to tell them that they are part of Israel's history, that they were baptized by passing through the sea with Moses. They passed under the same spiritual or the same cloud and ate the same spiritual food. So that's one connection I would make, is that he's in the previous chapter, he's trying to build up this idea that they are not so different from Israel and that they should be thinking along that sort of line to some extent, that all leads up to Christ. All the Jewish stuff leads up to Christ at the same moment that Christ intersects with this Greek culture, and they should avoid doing the things that the Jews did wrong and be all about Christ, and that they're supposed to flee from idolatry and flee from prostitutes and those who are doing things wrong in the Greek culture. You shouldn't offend Jews or Greeks. You should be considerate of their culture. And then he goes into this whole thing that to me sounds like very much like trying to get them to be less Greek, I guess is one way of saying it. Trying to be more godly and less Greek. Using some of their logic, because he does want to be all things to all men. He wants to appeal to Jews based on their Jewish roots, and he wants to appeal to Greeks based on their Greek logic. But ultimately, he's not trying to promote their way of thinking of things. He's trying to get them to submit to Christ, and he's just sort of using their rationale to get there. Living Legend says, basically, what is their bloodline biblically? No, it has nothing to do with bloodlines. Because Israel was chosen by the Most High, that's why he speaks as such. Well, in Paul's reasoning, the Jews who don't believe in Jesus are branches that are being broken off the tree. They're actually being rejected by God. So there's nothing special about unbelieving Jews in Paul's point of view. Meanwhile, the Greeks, the Gentiles who do believe in Jesus, are being grafted in, and so they are becoming part of the same tree, and the Jews who don't believe are getting broken off. So he's certainly not saying that there's something magically special about the bloodline of Israel. And even Jesus said that, he could raise up children of Abraham from the stones. He doesn't need the people standing there in their bloodlines. God Love says, I cover my hair when I pray and worship the Most High and talking to him. See, I what am I going to say? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And the Bible does say it. I don't think it says it as a command, but it suggests it, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Now, would I pray if my head was covered, like with a hat, or if I'm, stuck in my car in winter and I have a hat on or a hoodie or something? Am I going to take it off just to pray? I got to be honest, I'm not going to do that. I'm not a big hat-wearing guy, but I'm not the least bit concerned with the status of my head being covered or not when I'm praying, because I just don't think that God is operating on such a level. I think that there's a lot of reasons to try to get beyond that, but that Paul is trying to take a step towards that, and it can be misunderstood as being like this really hard and fast rule. Now, verse 17, he says, now in giving this next instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Now, remember, coming together is just the function of what we call a church, but should actually be translated as a congregation or an assembly. Thank you for the 13,000 likes, by the way. That's really cool to see. It's exciting. So the assembly, the congregation, is just them getting together. And as I've said over and over in this series, they would just talk about anything that is on their mind, any problems that they have. It wasn't just one guy standing up and giving a sermon. It was an assembly. And so he's saying, when you get together, I do not praise you because you get together for the worse, not for the better. 18, for in the first place, when you come together as a church, now, again, the word church should not be used. It should be just as an assembly. I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part, I believe it. Now, this, again, would be an entire city of Christians, however many there are in the city. Might only be 100, might be 300, who knows. Verse 19, for there also have come, verse 19, for there also have to be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Wow. there also have to be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Verse 20, therefore, when you come together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. So that speaks to the fact that the Lord's Supper had become an institution, a regular part of the assembly. Verse 21, for when you eat, each one takes his own supper first, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What am I to say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I do not praise you. Oh boy. Okay, so this one is not as complicated, obviously. But there's a lot of sort of subtext here you could read into. One is that they are doing the Lord's Supper regularly as a ritual, regular thing. Jesus did institute, getting together and eating the bread and drinking the wine. This also points to the fact that they actually got drunk on it, which debunks the idea that it was non-alcoholic grape juice that they were drinking back then. That Kent Hovind, I know, floated that one long ago, and I admired the effort, but clearly they are drinking actual alcoholic wine. And this speaks to the Greek side again, because in the Greek festivals and the Greek rituals, feasting and completely filling yourself up, indulging your senses, they would combine feasting with sex and with drugs and with demon worship and with getting drunk all at the same time. It was not a sober event, and they had no restraint. The whole point of Greek religion and enjoyment was total indulgence of everything they wanted. So now these Greeks are trying to do the Lord's Supper, but clearly they are, pigging out and getting drunk and being selfish like they would at a Greek religious event. So I think it's pretty clear to me that this ties in with the same kind of thing we have in the previous section. Greek tendencies that they haven't gotten rid of yet as new believers. They're still too Greek. They're not Christian enough yet. That is the common theme throughout a lot of these chapters in Corinthians. So I don't know if there's a lot more to say about that. One thing that's interesting is the idea that there has to be factions among you so that those who are approved may become evident among you. I think that's just a simple way of saying it's good to know that there are people who refuse to go along with what you guys are doing, and they are the ones who I approve of, because they're not doing the same thing as the rest. And so in that sense, it's not that there's an official division of a faction that has a name and a separate building they go to and all these things. It's just there are some people who refuse to go along with it. They're doing the better example. And so that's a good thing, because the rest of you should look at those guys and do what they do. Godlove says, like Woodstock, the festival. Yeah, I guess it would be. Welcome, patronizing saint. Let's see what the comments were here. Living Legend says he is trying to save them with their logic. Yeah, I think he's using arguments that are based on their philosophy and way of thinking, and then he's incorporating teachings about Scripture along the way. But that, you notice that he doesn't do that same kind of thing when he's talking to Jews. And so when he's talking to Jews, he starts talking about sacrifices and covenants and prophecies and Jewish things. But when he's talking to Greeks, he's using the Greek logic. Dawn Daystar says, I have to take my daughter to college. Have a wonderful day. Keep preaching. Check out this stuff on YouTube if you come back. This is all going to be available on YouTube later. You can rewatch it and the other stuff. Living Legend said Lord's Supper is Sabbath. I don't know if that's true. I think it would be, among the Jews, it would certainly be pretty, like, common sense for them to have a day of worship on the Sabbath, and then they would get together and make that the day of the Lord's Supper. Whether they did it more than once a week, whether they skipped some weeks, whether they did it on the Sabbath or not, I don't know. And I don't know if that's evident in the Bible. I think that might have just been something that's a very early tradition, and I think some of the early so-called church fathers wrote about that kind of stuff. So within 100 years or so of Jesus, or 200 years, a lot of these things turn into ritual traditions, but that doesn't mean that it's necessary or good. It just means that's how they decided to keep it around and make it into a tradition. But yeah, I'm not sure if the Lord's Supper, which I think a lot of us, we would call communion. But here's the other thing. He says, you have your own homes to eat and drink in. So the point of getting together and eating and drinking at the Lord's Supper is not to fill yourself up. It's a symbolic thing. And so you're supposed to be just getting together, and it might be like a snack or something, I guess, but it shouldn't be an actual feast. That it would be shameful to go get drunk and feast on the Lord's Supper. Now that would be a bummer for these Greeks because, they still want to do the Greek things. They want to keep being, enjoying the Greek way of life, but Paul's trying to rein them in. Now we've got a couple more sections here. This is a pretty long chapter, so I'm just going to go right to the next section. He says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread." Oh, this isn't really a different section. This is just a further clarification. "On the night when he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took also the cup after supper, saying, 'This is the cup. This cup is the new covenant.'" There's the key word, new covenant, "in my blood." By the way, that would have been a very shocking thing to say. That was not, the idea of us drinking Jesus's blood is normalized in Christian traditions because it's just, it's communion. It's, we drink red wine. It looks like blood. It reminds us of Jesus's blood on the cross. That wouldn't have been taken as a normal thing by these Jews sitting around the table with the Messiah. They still didn't really understand that he had to die and be pierced and bleeding. The idea that he was establishing a new covenant with his own blood and that they had to drink it is freaky. It's extreme. It's a radical, mind-blowing concept at the time. It's a shame that it turned... This is why I actually don't like communion and the traditions, because they devalue the actual original story by making it a routine. Is it really that you're doing that as a remembrance of how crazy it is that Jesus had to be killed and that he knew he had to be killed and he said this is a new covenant? I mean, the whole covenant with Sinai and the Moses laws had lasted for thousands of years. And then here he comes and says there's a new covenant with his own blood, and that they're supposed to do it, and as often as you drink it, do it in remembrance of me. He's changing the representation of the wine into a reminder of something very unhappy, something very difficult and unpleasant, which is that he had to be horribly killed. Now, of course, it goes on to represent forgiveness and the washing of sins with the blood, with the idea of the scapegoat and the sacrificial blood of the lamb, through going all the way back to Cain and Abel, and the fact that Abel's sacrifice was from an animal and it was pleasing to God. There's all this blood thing throughout the whole Old Testament, of course. But it's still shocking to think that the Messiah had to die. And so I don't like how the tradition just sort of makes it a routine, and then you're thinking more about the routine than the original story. That's why I also don't like holidays that much. It's why anything that gets repeated, like buzzwords, like the word rapture or even the word church. I don't like the word church because you just think church is church. I know what church is. You know what church is. We all have church. The word church is not in the Bible. In the Greek, you would never translate the Greek word ecclesia into church if you were to look at the Greek. But because it's a tradition, now we call it church. And we think we're talking about the same thing they were talking about, but they were talking about something very different. So was it on the Sabbath? Was it a weekly thing? Was it a once in a year thing? In the church I grew up in, communion was once or twice a year. I don't know how often, but it was a ritual, I think, done with the best of intentions. I'm not going to say that there's any negative thing, inserted in there. But nevertheless, are people really thinking about this story? Do they even read the story properly? Do they apply it? I don't know about that. Clearly these Greeks don't get it. They're getting together for the Lord's Supper and they're getting drunk and they're just enjoying themselves like it's a Greek festival. Verse 26, he says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So that's what it's supposed to represent, according to Paul here. Eating the bread and drinking from the cup is a way of proclaiming that the Lord died, and what that represents and what that means until he comes back. And so it's done actually with an expectation of his return. Kind of like you're marking time and you're saying, hey, we know that he died, but he's coming back. I'm sure there's more meaning to it, but back then, but that's sort of the obvious thing. Rachel says, "My friend studied all religion and said Jewish faith makes the most sense, so he converted." Yeah, a lot of people do that. It's kind of sad because the Bible says that Jews are actually spiritually blinded until Jesus comes back. And so to convert to Judaism, if you studied all religion, I mean, I guess they have all their counter arguments to Christianity in the New Testament, and so they just deny what is written in the Bible. But yeah, that happens a lot, actually. Doug Power says, "What's the difference in symbolic and prophetic?" A symbolic thing, you can do it more, you can do it less. You can do it, with different groups of people across generations at different times and places, and it doesn't affect anything. A prophecy has to actually be fulfilled at some point, and then it doesn't have to be done anymore because it's a fulfillment. Stapleton says, "I think it's appropriate to do during Passover, Easter. It represents sacrifice," says somebody else. "Should always reflect his death and resurrection." Doug says, body of Christ needs the blood inside the body to operate and function. Okay. I mean, let me put out a theoretical situation here. Let's say that modern day China, you have millions of Christians converting, millions of Chinese people converting from atheism and ancestor worship and whatever they have to, I know that's insulting because I don't know what they believe, but China's such a huge region, I could never pretend to know what they all believe. And they're converting to Christianity. And let's say these are very poor people, and they're not allowed to practice Christianity openly, but they have giant churches, giant assemblies, where thousands of people are getting together, and they have zero wine. I mean, none of them even own wine. Maybe they don't even make wine. If they did have some sort of alcohol, it would be something else, closer to sake or something like that. Is there absolutely anything they are lacking by not doing this? Is there something actually special about the wine and the bread? I mean, bread, okay, what if they use rice patties or corn in a different country or some other thing that they just have on hand? I refuse to believe that God would discriminate against believers based on them actually having wine available and bread at their gatherings. I think that clearly the heart is what matters, the Spirit is what matters, the Word of God is what matters, and God would be much more pleased with people if you just read His actual words and studied them and prayed by yourself even, than if you got together and had a big bunch of wine and bread and said it was in the memory of Jesus, but you never actually studied it. I mean, there are people who put their lives at risk to serve God around the world who never drink wine ever. And so I don't think there's anything spiritually important about doing this literally. I think that as an institution, Jesus told His disciples to do that, and it was a reminder of the covenant, and I think that if you could do it, there'd be value to it, and Jesus instituted it for a reason, and that the tradition probably had an important function early on. But I would be very surprised if Jesus Himself was offended at somebody never doing the Lord's Supper communion, as long as their heart was in the right place. W. Hunt says, didn't they have non-fermented wine? I don't think so, because right here it says that they got drunk at these events. So you don't get drunk on grape juice. Okay. So, verse 27 says, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy way shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. There's another reason to avoid it. But a person must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat the bread and drink of the cup. For the one who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not properly recognize the body. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number are asleep, meaning dead. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord so that we will not be condemned along with the world. Interesting. I do definitely remember that from my church growing up, is that part of communion and having the bread and wine was supposed to be a time of self-examination, and that you weren't supposed to do it unless you had basically made yourself right with other people and examined yourself and repented of things you were doing wrong. It was supposed to be a time of preparation so that you would, I think they were trying to go very close to the actual teaching here, which is great. If you're going to do it, you should do it that way. Debbie says, good morning. I am a little late. Yeah, you're towards the end here. But you're going to still hear some interesting stuff, I think. God Love says, wow, pastor told me one day they don't use wine in the Bible. It's grape juice, not wine. Baptism, pastor. Well, he would have to explain to me how you could get drunk off of grape juice, because I don't think, verse 21 here says, when you eat, each one takes his own supper first, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. So it seems to be actual wine. And that's why it's translated as wine in the Bible. If it was juice, they would translate it as juice, I'm pretty sure. So, now, this whole idea that you are supposed to judge yourself and examine yourself when you do it is great, because it means not only are you remembering that Jesus is going to come back, that itself is supposed to have a very sobering effect, which is ironic because you're drinking alcohol, but you're supposed to be very cognizant of Jesus returning, because when he returns, he's going to judge things. And so you don't want to have Jesus suddenly come back when you're doing something wrong, like prostitution or whatever the crazy stuff is that the Greeks were doing. You want to be in a good state of mind and be very mindful of his sacrifice and humble and serious, And so when you eat the bread and you think of him dying, his flesh being whipped and tortured and dying on the cross, how can you have a anything goes casual attitude when you're doing that? You can't. It would be impossible. When you're drinking the wine, you're not thinking of how good the wine is and getting drunk. You're supposed to be thinking of blood and how precious it is and how precious the sacrifice of Jesus was, and be remembering that he's going to come back victorious and judging. And so judge yourself before you drink it, because otherwise you are essentially disgracing Jesus' sacrifice. And it says, so that we will not be condemned along with the world. Now, that is an important reminder that in Paul's point of view, the entire world is going to get judged, and Christians who do things rightly are going to be an exception to that. He's leaving the door open that some of these same people who are in their congregation will actually not be spared the condemnation. It's not an automatic salvation for everybody who claims to be Christian, and not even for everybody who partakes in the communion. He's leaving the door open that theoretically people could be condemning themselves while they are partaking in the communion. Now, also, the fact that he says in verse 30 here, for this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number are asleep, meaning dead. Paul seems to think that sickness and weakness and dying is a result of not properly worshiping Jesus. And I don't want to overlook that, because I think it's very important to recognize that Paul is just a human being, even though he has the Holy Spirit, and there are times when he gets a direct message from God. We saw that already earlier in 1 Corinthians. He gets a direct message from God about a specific issue. Then he turns around immediately after and says, and for this other stuff, God does not give me a commandment, so I will give you my own advice. Paul is just a guy like you and me, except he had an extraordinary encounter with Jesus. He learned a lot. He was specially chosen. Millions of ways that Paul is different and in some ways, better than you or me, right? I mean, I would honor Paul, all day long. But that doesn't mean he knows literally everything, and especially the timing of things. This is a point I make in my book, Maybe Everyone is Wrong, which, by the way, if you haven't gotten it, that's what it looks like. It is available on Amazon. The link is in my link tree here, which is in my bio. I talk about the fact that Paul and nobody else in the New Testament knew the timing of anything. They didn't know when Jesus would come back. Not even Jesus knew when Jesus is going to come back. It says only the Father knows. And since Jesus is not the Father, that means Jesus didn't know. So Jesus says, I'm coming back soon. He says, you are going to see me coming back just as I'm going up. He says, all these messages that are for those people on earth. But then he also admits he doesn't know when this is going to happen. The presumption is it's going to happen within that generation. Everybody is assuming that. Paul is assuming that literally they need to maintain their physical purity and avoid getting involved in sexual immorality and these bad things, because Jesus might literally show up out of the clouds one day and they'll be caught in the act doing evil. He's assuming that they're getting weak and sick and dying because they're not properly worshiping Jesus. Now, it might be that because they are doing this communion and they are disgracing themselves by feasting and getting drunk on the communion wine, it might very well be that God actually does punish those people and made them sick. The Holy Spirit itself might abandon them, or they might be afflicted because of the fact that they were doing wrong. I absolutely think that's possible. I mean, miracles were happening. Demons were getting cast out. People were being healed. There's no reason why something like that couldn't happen in reverse, and these people couldn't be suffering because they're doing wrong. However, if the idea is that people shouldn't be getting sick and dying if they're worshiping Jesus properly, I think that's evidence of why later on, when Paul is starting to get sick or dealing with some sort of problems, he prays about it multiple times, and God ends up telling him, my grace is sufficient for you. Stop asking me for health and for perfect things. Paul did get raised from the dead after he was killed. He had deaths, plural. It says he died often in the Bible. That might be an exaggeration, but that is what the Bible actually says. And so if you believe it, you believe it. He was in shipwrecks. He was at the bottom of the ocean for days. He was stoned to death and body dragged out of the city. Paul, if anyone knows about this, Paul would know that Jesus has the power to literally bring you back from the dead and keep you physically healthy until he comes back. I mean, that is just something that Jesus can literally do. He's living proof. And so if he was to say, okay, Jesus has been keeping me miraculously alive, a poisonous snake bites him. Remember that story? He shakes it off and the people around him worship him as a god because they've never seen something like that before. He should be dead. There's all these stories where Paul should have died and he's not dying. And so clearly it would make sense for him to think, hey, I haven't died and I've been bitten by snakes and stoned to death and shipwrecked and under the water for days and stuff. You guys are dying and getting sick. Clearly you're not doing something right. Right? So I think it's very interesting that Paul, and I'm going to guess this is relatively early in Paul's ministry, because, well, I don't know. But then again, I think he talks about Timothy being involved, and that might be later on. So I'm not sure where this fits, right? I'm just speculating. But if there's a point at which Paul realizes he's actually going to die, and he won't be there to see it, you start to see Paul talk about death as something that he's hoping for, and that he would rather die than stick around on earth, and that he wants to go, and he would wish that he could go and meet with Jesus instead of being on this earth. And so I think there's a point at which, Paul is coping with mortality as a Christian, because in the Jewish way of thinking, a lot of Jews didn't even believe in resurrection. Jesus talked about it, and Christians should all believe in it. But in the old Jewish way of thinking, there's no resurrection. Pharisees actually were known for, one of the good things that they actually did is they believed in the resurrection. And Sadducees did not. And so, I don't know. It's just interesting that Paul might have, just how he's thinking of shaving your head, has some sort of spiritual connection to the angels. And you should cover your head for the angels' sake. And there's all this stuff going on here, drinking the blood and getting sick if you don't do it right, and all these things. It's still in this sort of superstitious frame of mind. And if we're not experiencing that today, that might be because it wasn't really that true at the time. It was just Paul using his own understanding as a very advanced thinker, but still in this culture where he's got all this Jewish baggage and Pharisaic understanding and Old Testament understanding, and then he's got all this Greek influence around him, and clearly Jesus is reaching out to the Greeks and is validating them as members who can become part of the church. And so he's between these two worlds, or three if you count the Romans, and he has the Holy Spirit, but he doesn't know everything. And so sometimes he's just using his own judgment. And this is where that sounds terrible to a fundamentalist who says every single word in the Bible is 100% just the Holy Spirit talking, and the guy just happens to be there writing it. As opposed to what we've seen in Corinthians ourselves, which is that sometimes God is explicit and sometimes he straight up doesn't say anything. And Paul admits, the Lord did not give me a commandment on this, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. And then here he's saying, reason amongst yourselves, ask yourselves, isn't it nature telling you that women should have long hair? Isn't nature telling you that it's bad for a woman to shave her head? That's not God talking, that's Paul talking. And so it sounds like he's giving them his own advice in some of these things. Now, verse 33, there's just two more verses. It says, so then, brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that you do not come together for judgment. As to the remaining matters, I will give instructions when I come. Now, he says that, but then there's 5 more chapters. So the next chapter is going to be about spiritual gifts, which ought to be very interesting. But that's all he has to say. And then he says there's remaining matters that he will actually give instructions to in person. He's not going to bother writing about it. So I'm not sure why he would write about some and not others, but unfortunately, that's where his instructions on that point ends. All right, guys, that's not Revelation. That's I was looking at my book about Revelation. 1 Corinthians 11. Interesting chapter. The whole thing about women, heads being covered. I will make one more point about that because I kind of skipped over the general interpretation that everyone goes by. And I think it's a good reminder. The idea that God is the head of Jesus, Jesus is the head of man, man is the head of the woman. Theoretically, that puts women further away from the Father and further away from Jesus. And it almost implies that women have to have a man in order to know Jesus. That's not the case. But I think that there is a very valid point being made here when you align it with the entire old system of thinking about women and men, that women traditionally were under the authority of a father until they were handed off to a husband, and then they were under that authority of the husband. And it was all about trying to protect women. I mean, that's actually why they did it. It was so that the woman was never vulnerable and, without direction, without some sort of male guidance. That sounds horrible to a feminist, because why should I need male guidance? I don't need a man, blah, blah, blah. In the ancient world, it's tied in with the whole chivalry idea and this, idea that women need men to properly take care of them, that it's dangerous to be an independent woman. It would be better for her to have a good man above her. And so why not do that? Why not make the system such that women don't have to fend for themselves and be independent? They should just have a good man, and the man takes the daughter from the husband, or from the father, and then there you have it. So the idea of being the head of the woman, I don't think it's a big spiritual metaphor. I think there are layers to what he's saying here, that especially when he says man should not have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. Man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. Indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. Modern biblical scholars hate this because they want to try to erase, they want to try to bring this somehow up to date with modern society, and I'm not going to do that. The Bible just straight up says that women were created for the sake of men. Ancient scholars and old-time scholars had no trouble understanding what Paul was saying here. They still lived in the same tradition. It was very obvious that women were considered to be, or I should say wives were considered to be, supports for their husbands, not the reverse. And the idea that, the woman is, the soulmate, the missing ingredient that solves all of my problems in life, and I need to depend on my woman to help me through all of my problems, and I would be half a man without her, and I would just, all this that just didn't exist in the ancient world, especially in the Greek world, where they didn't even like their women, basically. But it didn't exist in the Jewish world either. And Paul is just endorsing that point of view, and he's not bringing it up here as a revolutionary concept. He's just reminding them of this idea. But to Greeks, they're not familiar with the Torah and the Old Testament, so he's bringing up the fact that the original man was created in God's image, and then the woman was created in his image, in Adam's image. And so he's making a point out of that topic, which they are not familiar with because they're Greeks. Okay? So I don't think I have to make a big point about it. I have no dog in the fight, so to speak. But just to do justice to that text, a lot of preachers are going to try to minimize that aspect and try to say this is just about a man, somehow man and woman are still completely equal in this, because later on he says, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originated from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. He softens that stance, but he still made the point for a reason. And so he's trying to say it's not, that's also why I'm not emphasizing it a lot, because it's not actually a big deal. But it is, he's appealing to the logic of nature and the order in which God did things, and he's expecting the people to be responding to that. but just not making a huge deal about it. So God Love says, I'm really happy for the study, Terry. You make me think to be more careful with the words. I missed a couple comments here. Baoli says, it's interesting how God can choose to simply stay silent on matters that we are so loud and divided on. Yeah, that's true. Anything else I missed here? Stapleton says, I think women would be better protected of evil if some of those customs remain today. I think so too. And that's the thing. Even if it were to go back to that sort of, it wouldn't have to be literally illegal for a woman to leave her father's house or whatever. It could just be a cultural thing that Christians do, and that could be nice. I mean, there's lots of cultures that do that. Muslim and Indian and Chinese, and just like almost every culture except Western materialist, atheist, modern culture still does that same idea. But anyway, I guess if we're going to be tolerant, you'd want to tolerate those cultures. So I don't know if it's considered a bad thing to mention it, but this is an ancient Jewish and Greek culture argument, so that's where Christianity was born out of. Wealthgistic says, blessings to you. Wolfbox, you made it understandable. Thank you. All right, guys, that's the point. We're going to leave it at today. Tomorrow, like we said, it's going to be about using spiritual gifts. Although I also want to say that I am writing a review of Season 2 of The Chosen. And once that's finished, I don't think it'll be finished tomorrow, but once it is finished, I will also read it here on the stream, if God is willing, and then we can talk about Season 2 of The Chosen, because I finished watching that. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thank you for the 20,000 likes. We just hit 20,000 a little while ago, so that's very nice of you guys. Remember my Linktree so that you can go look at my YouTube channel. Remember for the book links if you want to get Fire in the Rabbit Hole, for example, or you still haven't gotten Maybe Everyone is Wrong. What else? My Substack, where I write those articles, is linked in my Linktree as well. So once again, that's the Linktree, Linktree/Wolfpox. You'll find my Discord channel there too, so you can come say hi and we can talk there. All sorts of stuff. Lots of links there. Later today, I am supposed to be on the TNT radio show again, and we'll be talking about some interesting stuff related to, I believe, a group of students that were trying to say that Western science should be completely disposed of because it is discriminatory against traditional folk medicine, and they need to decolonialize science and get rid of science. And there's a couple of other things we're going to be talking about on the TNT radio show. I'll be posting a link to that later, so on Telegram and whatnot. So yeah, nice and busy, trying to put up material for you guys. So thank you for coming and supporting it. That's why I do it. It's because you guys are actually paying attention and you are enjoying it. So I wouldn't be doing it otherwise. God bless you. Thank you. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow.